Okay, so
Okay.
excellent. There we are. I'm going to change my review to speaker, which will affect, I think, the recording. Welcome to Thursday Book Club. Thank you very much, everybody, for coming today, and to any of my fellow people in lockdown, commiserations. For those who are just out, congratulations. What I might ask everybody to do is just mute, except for Kathryn and me. That'll stop the view flicking and make it easier to hear. So very excited to have Kathryn Heyman here, who is a wonderful author and also a very dear friend of mine. Kathryn was born in New South Wales, brought up in Lake Macquarie with 4 siblings, so she comes from a big family. She spent a lot of years in the United Kingdom as a young adult, where she studied and where she was first published. She's the author of 6 novels, including The Breaking, which was longlisted for the Orange Prize and shortlisted for the Scottish Writer of the Year Award. Most recently, her novel is Storm and Grace, and now she's published this memoir, I think you can see in the background, which is called Fury. Welcome to you, Kathryn. How are you?
Hi, good to be here.
Excellent. Has it been a good week for you? Has it been an odd week? How's the week been treating you?
I mean, it's an odd week, isn't it? The sort of moment that you go, okay, this is stretching on, you know, in Sydney. That's kind of odd. But no, it's been a nice week. As you know, Suzanne, I have, and I think as Betty knows as well, Betty is in a group I run called the Immersion Group. So she's heard me kind of talk about the things that bring joy on more than one occasion. So I've been returning to the love of my youth, which was roller skating. So that's kind of resetting me. It's really interesting. That and writing. So the week is adequate, Suzanne. Thank you for asking.
Excellent. Let's dive right into Fury. Now, Fury is a story that comes from a time when you were 20 years old and you went to work on a prawn trawler. Now, Kathryn, I've known you for a long time, and you've never really struck me as the woman who has spent time working with a whole bunch of men on a prawn trawler. How did you find yourself there at such a young age, and where was it?
Yeah. So it's that phrase, how did you find yourself there, is really interesting. I know that wasn't deliberate, but that in fact is exactly what happened. I did find myself there, actually. I left where I was in Sydney, and oddly enough, today I was writing something about it for a different book, and I was writing about the feeling that growing up in New South Wales, away from Sydney. Sydney was the sort of biggest escape I could imagine. So I was a young woman in Sydney, and I had let's say a series of traumatic events, to paraphrase Lemony Snicket. And what I kind of have said to people, because it feels to be true, is that I wasn't making a decision. I just kind of had an animal instinct, really, a kind of visceral, physical, I have to get away, kind of from myself. I have to make a different story, which I know sounds very constructed, but actually that was the sort of instinct. I have to get as far away as I can, where I'm kind of not known by anyone, where I'm not seen by anyone, and kind of even by myself. So I can figure out how to be different and how to be someone else and how to make a different life, because the life I'm in is not working for me and I don't want it. Years later, I read the poem, The Importance of Elsewhere by Philip Larkin. And it just was like, oh, that's what I was doing. That's what I was doing, was I was finding myself elsewhere, you know, and by being elsewhere, allowing myself to be different.
like in my head, I'm not a boat person. I sort of imagine you on this sort of yacht-like thing, but you've got prawns there as well. Is that what a prawn trawler's like?
Oh, it is so much like that. It is so glamorous. Actually, I will say before I answer that, I went back out weirdly on the actual trawler that I worked on as a 20-year-old, which is called the Ocean Thief. I couldn't have been on a trawler with a better name for a future writer. You know, if it had been called, I don't know, the prawn catcher, it may not have been so inviting. But I went back out on that boat, and I went out for a week, and I'd said to them, look, I was a deckhand. I know how to work. So they had to take time out of their season to come and pick me up, the crew from Groote Island. And I flew up to Groote Island. It was all very last minute, got on this boat, and I had become this kind of, swanning about kind of journalista sort of person going, I think you can all sort out the catch there. I'll just be reading on the upper deck. And are there any snacks? So I'd kind of become the person who was expecting it to be a glamorous yacht. A trawler. So where I got on a fishing trawler off in the Timor Sea. I was fishing in the Timor Sea, in the Arafura Sea, the Gulf of Carpentaria, and ill-advisedly during the wrong season also Bonaparte Gulf, which basically at the top of Australia where those 2 points are, I was in those sorts of oceans. I wasn't intending to become a deckhand. I had no skills really of any kind, and I was not physically strong, and I didn't consider myself to be physically brave. I had no evidence that I was physically brave or physically adventurous or able to throw myself into nature. Any of the things actually that I know about myself now all came from that time. Before that time, I was not that. I had no sense that I could be that person. So I got to the end of the country and kind of knew, it's still not far enough. I'm still me, which is the kind of classic runaway's dilemma, right? I guess you're always trying to run from yourself and, it's still me. And I was very traumatized. So I realize now responding kind of out of a PTSD. Actually, that's the language I bring to it now. It's not the language I had then or a consciousness I had then. Got to the end of the country, had a very strong sense of it's not far enough. And I saw an ad, in youth hostels when there'd be kind of signs stuck up everywhere back in the day, when that was how we communicated, with kind of bits of paper stuck on notice boards. So there was a bit of paper stuck on a notice board in, Dina, you might know this, I don't know if it's still there, Lamoureux Lodge in Darwin. It was it's kind of a rite of passage for backpackers to stay at Lamoureux Lodge. And there was a notice stuck up that said, cook wanted on international sailing, passport necessary. And I saw it and thought, that's what I'm destined for. That's my next step. So I went down to the marina, and this yacht, the Gloria, it was called, that yacht was beautiful. It was gleaming. The woman who owned the yacht, I didn't meet, it was a family, so I only met the woman and the nanny. And the woman who owned it was, those women who they wear, the bob is perfect, the kind of the white just delicately matching the little blue sort of stripes. Nothing is overstated. And it's so, the t-shirt, that t-shirt cost more than, my car. It's that whole look. She was that woman with just that kind of right tone of you're not really one of us, are you, darling? She had that, but she was friendly. So I interviewed, she invited me up into the cabin of this. Again, it was a yacht. I mean, still now, I just think, oh my God, it was so beautiful. I did sail as a kid. I have always been, I would say, a creature of the sea. So I did have that kind of, oh, this is beautiful. And we sat down in this glamorous cabin with me feeling very much like I was so out of place, but I was desperate to get this job. And the first question, a perfectly reasonable one that she asked me was, what would you cook for us? And I said, I put no thought into it, not a skerrick of thought. So I said, casserole. And she said, this woman went, we have no budgetary restrictions. And she, I swear, looked like she was going to vomit. And while I was thinking, I don't even understand what that could mean, to have no budgetary restrictions, she asked me again, and the only posh thing that I could think of that one might eat at that moment in my life. Also, I was vegetarian. So, I had no idea what kind of meat you'd cook. So I said, beef Wellington. And whereupon she said, and how would you cook it? And I said, with beef. Absolutely, to my surprise, I did not get the job. So that vision fell through. And after that, I guess the desire had been awoken, and I met a boy. He was a boy who was a first mate on a fishing trawler. That he'd been on trawlers since he was about 14. Real old school fisher, amazing, beautiful human. And he had to change crews. He'd had to go back to his country for I guess you would say for sorry business. He'd lost a family member, so he'd had to lose the boat that he normally went out on. So he was in the situation where he was going out on this new boat with a new crew, and he said, come with me. And I trusted him, and so I went.
And it was really quite the adventure. Now, before that, you spoke of a series of traumatic events. And of course, one of those events was a particularly traumatic event following a cab ride home very late at night when you were very young and very vulnerable, and the aftermath of what happened. What I'm interested in is, rather than unwrapping that and exactly what that was, is this. You're a novelist, so you've written 6 novels. And for me, I suppose, when I want to write about difficult things, fiction is a beautiful place, because you can say, this has nothing to do with me. This is the muse, this is the writing, this is the imagination. And lo and behold, just when you're writing about one of the most difficult things in your life, you switch to memoir. Why was that?
Well, there are a number of reasons. I've written about male violence against women a lot. I've written about versions of there are 2 things that have been common across all my books, across 6 novels and 12 plays, that I look at and go, that's what I've been writing all this time. And one of those things is to do with power imbalance, I guess, between men and women in various forms across different centuries, across different countries, in different contexts. And the other is the question that I have continued to return to across all of my work has been, what is it that makes someone resilient? What is it that makes one person survive trauma well and another person not? And that question, which I've asked in all of my books, which I was kind of aware of asking, I was sort of aware that, okay, I'm writing about this shipwreck and massacre in the 17th century, but what I'm really interested in is the guilt of the person who survives. So I sort of knew I was doing that, but I came to a point of realizing that I was writing that thread because that's my life question. Why did I survive trauma better than someone else? Better than some members of my family? What was that luck? What was that? So I wanted to answer that question. So that was one thing. I didn't set out to write a memoir. I didn't know what I was writing. I had said for a long time, I always knew I was going to write about the ocean thief because it's I never talked to really many friends about it, but I've told Richard, my husband, stories about it over the years. And every now and then he'd say, God, tell me another one, because it was sort of hilarious. And for a long time, I felt like, yeah, it was the most interesting thing I ever did. It was adventurous, it was formative, and it made me think about myself so differently. So I kind of knew I would, but I didn't know how I would write it. I was thinking it was a novel, that I was going to write a novel for years. I would write a novel about the ocean thief, that would just be a kind of cracking, daring do story, I guess. But around the time that I was starting to think about, maybe I might revisit that, I was also thinking about it. I started writing it, I think, in 2018. So Trump was in power still, and there was the pussy grabbing had happened, right? So it was there was that feeling of kind of group fury. So that combined with, I guess, a conversation I was having privately and to some degree publicly about the nature of shame and who owns it, where shame should sit. The idea that women are constantly silenced, or historically, that there's sort of that thing of putting it all together, that at the point that women start going, I'm just going to have a word about this. And then all the women in all the little different tiles around the computer screen effectively go, oh, you know what, me too, actually. So there was a feeling I had a feeling of, just tell it. Just put the shame where it belongs. It's not yours. So, but even then, I thought that I just wrote it, allowing myself to think it might be a novel, it might be a memoir. I'm telling the true story, but I'm a novelist. So of course I write as a novelist. Also, it is intrinsically, it was a bit of a gift because it is intrinsically kind of structured like a novel. There is a threshold. I get on that boat, I leave the land, and I return different. And that is the true story. So I kind of felt like it could have been a novel. My name was different then. So I used the name that I had then, which was Casey. And I just let myself think, maybe I'll call it autofiction. Maybe I'll call it a novel. I don't know. So like lots of writers, I had to kind of allow myself to write it privately. As Stephen King says, write it with the door closed. And I love that I feel like when he says that in his book On Writing, it's not just about, being not seen. You close the door so people can't see you and you're not sharing the work, but it's also a physical barrier. So I kind of created that feeling. And only at the end, I thought, yeah, I also, at that moment, I was feeling, honestly, I've not said this anywhere else. So it's really I'm just saying it now. I might not feel this tomorrow. I felt it in that moment. I was feeling a bit bored with fiction. I was feeling a bit bored with fiction as a reader. I mean, honestly, when I've heard people say that to me in the past, I'm like, well, clearly you don't have any emotional intelligence, so that'll be your problem. But I sort of felt like I was hungry for something else. I was hungry for a kind of clarity and coolness that I felt I could bring in a memoir more, more clearly and more straightforwardly than I could.
And what surprised me too was with so much humour. And the books before that, so Floodline and Storm and Grace, are captivating, compelling books. Not funny, I would say. Whereas this book, Fury, which is about difficult issues and is, as you said, about trauma, is really funny. Do you think you tapped into that because of the memoir, or because it was the way to tell a story that was too hard to tell otherwise?
It's funny because, oddly enough, although those last few books, probably from, I would say The Accomplice, Floodline, Storm and Grace, they're not funny books. The Accomplice is the one about the massacre. But I would say my first two books, and the second one in particular, has a lot of humor in it, and it's a lot about using humor to deflect and to manage pain and trauma. And the fourth one, Captain Starlight's Apprentice, I find hilarious, although it is also about, if I describe the subject, it doesn't sound so cheery. A lot of my plays in the past, I kind of had form in putting trauma and wit together. We had a running joke, my partner and I, for years, that all my reviews, but as a playwright and as a performer, and it went into the first novel as well, really, the number of reviews that said witty and poignant, just those two words, it was very particular. So I felt like that combination of I knew that as a performer. So when I'd written plays and performed in them, and I co-wrote with a comedian, a British comedian, the comedian Joanne Wright. We performed and wrote together. And I really learned from her that something really fabulous happens when you deliver a punchline, when you deliver a laugh, something physically happens. She's a really, really talented, gifted comedian and comic actor. Who would make me laugh so much that my filter has gone. She made me laugh so much that I literally peed myself. There, we are being recorded, aren't we?
You heard it at the Thursday Book Club. Thank you.
I just forgot that you're recording. I can't deny it.
We're all friends here, Kathryn, and the wider world's your friend too.
Anyway, so I learned from her that something happens in an audience, actually. When you laugh, you physically, your solar plexus opens up, your body releases, your diaphragm drops. So then you're in a kind of state that's quite receptive. And if you then on stage come in with something that's kind of tough or hard, it's sort of easier. And also it goes in deeper. So I was sort of conscious of that. But it may be that, of course, I mean, you know me, that is more my true form. I mean, people have said to me in the past that you're so funny. I'm hilarious. I know I don't seem it right now when I'm talking about.
Always let me never say it, because then.
No, it's right. As soon as you say that, people are like,
for example, is not proof.
You're not seeming that funny to me right now. That is more my natural voice, which is both kind of, that has some self-deprecation in it and some coolness, I think.
Yeah, I loved it for many reasons, particularly that. I'm not mindful of the time. I'm going to open it up for questions in 1 minute. And for everybody here, we normally finish at about 8:30. I'm going to push it a bit to about 20 to 9, or maybe even 8:45, depending on questions. But if you need to leave, just leave. This is the anti-book club, in which you turn up when you can, you leave when you have to, and you don't have to read if you don't want to, except for Fury, this week by Kathryn Heyman. Kathryn, as well as being a writer, you're a mentor as well. And can you tell me a little bit about your mentoring program?
So I set up 12 years ago, I think in 2010, I think that's right, the Australian Writers Mentoring Program, which pairs established writers, so writers who all of the mentors have got 5 books published, usually internationally. So they pair with new and emerging writers. I say new and emerging, I mean, some of the people who go through the mentoring program, you know, are well published. The Dictionary of Lost Words was one that came out of the program. She was mentored by Tony Jordan. So I'm really proud of it. I really love it, actually. And what's been interesting for me is that it's kind of, yeah, the stuff that I do as a mentor when I work with people individually, that it's people have often said, how does it intersect with your kind of writing life? Actually, I've found it enriches it and nurtures it. Yeah. So it's I really love it. I mean, part of it for me, Suzanne, was I've done so much teaching. I taught at Oxford. I taught at the University of Sydney, lots of university teaching, and I just started to not value it and started to really understand that what was valuable and what I kind of think of as being like a hit rate was that kind of 1-to-1. You know, and that's been true, that when I look, you know, there are lots of ways of measuring success as a writer. There are lots of ways of deciding whether you've done the project that you wanted to do, and publication is just one of them. And it's not the one that matters for everyone. But on that count, I kind of felt like, you know what, I've been at that point, I felt like I've taught writing for as long as I've been writing, and I've taught, you know, at the highest, like, you know, the University of Oxford MPhil in writing. It's kind of, well, look, if you're going to set an academic boundary around writing courses, we're going to, you know, that has some value. And students were not hitting their promise. They weren't publishing necessarily. The hit rate, I know it's a crass term, but the hit rate was kind of low. So over 5 years, if I taught 150 students, there might be kind of 2 who were really publishing fruitfully, or, you know, so I felt like I wanted to see more fruit and to have more connection, actually, with the people I was working with. So it's been beautiful for that. And yeah, as Betty knows, at the minute I'm kind of doing some stuff for kind of a broader group. So yeah, I actually really love that side of the creative life, you know, working with people. It's really fulfilling.
Thanks so much, Kathryn. Kathryn, before we open it up for questions, 3 lockdown reads. Have you got any recommendations for us in lockdown, or us coming out of lockdown, or us glad we're not in lockdown?
Yeah. Well, they're not lockdown specific reads. They're just reads that I have been loving.
Yes.
So one actually is someone that I mentored, because not just to plug her, but, you know, because it's a really beautiful book. And this book is called The Covered Wife by Lisa Emanuel. It is such a gorgeous novel. It's about a young, a Jewish lawyer, but with no kind of sense of her own religion, I guess, in Sydney, in Bondi, who falls in love and becomes part of a pretty extreme sort of Jewish cult, which, again, I'm aware doesn't sound luscious, but she writes about desire and food and love and spirituality, like, just, I was going to say like no one else, but it's a very, very nourishing read. It's actually just beautiful. And that's just out. It's just out in June. What month are we in now?
We're in July. In July, 1 month to go. Maybe.
So that's one. The second one is Stranger Care by Sarah Santilles, the American writer. Stranger Care is a beautiful memoir about Sarah's desire to adopt a baby, and the route that she took was through the foster system. And it's kind of about how we care for each other, and how we care for the world. Sarah's also a kind of theologian and an environmentalist, and so she brings a kind of whole load of cross wisdom, ex-theologian, I should say. So that was the other one. And the third is not new at all. So Sarah's book, it was out in May, same month as Fury. And the third is Madeline Miller's Circe, which I'm aware some people might have already read. I was thinking this afternoon, what are the books that I have felt really nourished by? And that I read Circe late. I read it last year during lockdown. And I just loved the combination of it being, kind of kick-ass feminist, a real a turning around and a turning under of the story of Odysseus, a recentering it, and but also just a cracking good read, and beautifully written and joyous and fun and kind of wild. So I feel like that's what I'm going to go back to this week, because I'm really in search of something that's going to give me some of those things, joy and wildness. Unless anyone else got any better suggestions.
Fantastic. Look, I'll pop those suggestions in this week's newsletter, so you've got them and you can seek them out. Thank you so much, Kathryn. I'm going to open it up for questions. I'm going to do it in a very technologically detailed way. Can you just put your hand up and I'll choose you? Okay, who's questions? It's the first question that's always a little bit tricky, is it not? There'll be lots, Kathryn. There we go, Michelle and Helen Richards. Michelle, was that a hand raise?
It was a hand raise.
Yes, Michelle, over to you.
I was just wondering, Kathryn, if you felt that memoir was particularly potent and powerful sort of genre for women, in terms of often women's stories have been, erased or, just ignored in history, personal stories, or in terms of being more public figure. And so it's a way of women kind of filling in that gap and writing themselves into the narratives, and also being a really active agent in the narrative as well, rather than being a passive subject in someone else's story.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. Look, I'll say two things. One is that I noticed that memoir is a bigger genre than it was, say, 15 years ago. I'm also conscious that when I first began publishing, which was 20 years ago or so, that I was very coy about that whole, first novels. Often people will always say, was it autobiographical? And I was very, very resistant to owning any autobiographical elements in my first novel. Although, it's in a family with a prison in the backyard. And indeed, if you've read Fury, you will know that I had prison in my backyard, a literal prison. So, it was a bit autobiographical. So I think that there's a kind of a sense of claiming permission that is happening, broadly speaking. But I think memoir has been around for a long time as a form. It's interesting now. It has range. I keep thinking about people like Deborah Levy, who just write these kind of cool, sharp memoirs. So yeah, it's a really, really interesting point, Michelle.
Thank you, Michelle.
Thank
Helen.
you.
Oh, we've got you on mute. Sorry, I should have reminded people to unmute who was speaking.
It's always that moment.
You actually answered the question. It was a very similar question. So yeah, about memoir and being negated, and women's provinces, and actually the relationship between, as the quote being, that men imagine worlds and women use their own, which is, yeah, right. But yes, no, you've answered it. Thank you.
Yeah, that's such an interesting quote. Yeah. I actually, that's one of the reasons that I liked Cersei. I think that speaks to a slightly different version of that idea, you know, that men imagine worlds where there are only men. But of course, the women are carrying on in those mythological worlds, or in those historical worlds, or in those worlds of war, or, you know, we were talking the other night about the Chicago 7, you know, and I was saying, I'm not watching it. I don't care how brilliant it is. It's not interesting for me. There's no women in it. It's not interesting. Sorry. I've done it. I've watched enough films where there are no women. So yeah, I think that kind of women are perhaps reminding each other and, you know, the world that there's women have always been in the story and have always been at the center of their own stories. Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah.
I think we've got time for one more question. Is there a question here? Yes, Dina. Question.
I wanted to know what you think about the difference between fiction and memoir. For example, can you go deeper, do you think, in fiction than in memoir? Can you tell a story in a way, in a more truthful way, because you've got that freedom to invent and to explore, which isn't necessarily so in memoir?
Yeah, look, I think that perhaps I've certainly had some of those thoughts in the past. It wasn't my experience this time. I mean, I think what I would always say to a new memoirist is it's important to remember that the memoir isn't a series of this happened and then this happened and then this happened. It's not you telling your life story to a mate. It's a literary form. And so you have to figure out what's the center of the form, what's the arc. You have to do all of those things the same way you would with a novel. And I will say that for me, it's not just that I didn't have the distance required to write this particular memoir until now. I needed, I think, the craft skills that I acquired over, you know, all those novels and all those plays and all those scripts. I think that that's what I needed to bring to the memoir. So I'm just not sure. I'm still figuring it out, to be honest, Dina. I'm still figuring out whether I can neatly sum up a kind of difference between fiction and memoir. I mean, there have been autofiction has been a form for a very, very long time. That's not, I mean, Proust, you know, Proust literally, I mean, he didn't even bother changing the names famously of his neighbors or friends, and then was sort of astonished when people got offended, you know. So arguably, you know, a lot of memoirists are more fictional than Proust. So I think that there's always a bit of bleed. But yeah, I think it's what I would say is different ideas require different forms and we require different genre for sure. And there are some things that I think, you know, depending on the writer, are going to be better found in a metaphor or in a story that they can play with in a different way. For me, this story required a particular version of telling the truth. But that was partly, as I said, because the story itself contained such a sort of dynamic narrative arc, and, you know, both in terms of the kind of the adventure story, but also the character, being me, transformation. So I kind of, in a way, didn't have to do too much. I'm not sure whether that will be I'm writing something now that you know, could be memoir, could be fiction, but I think it will require being made into fiction. So I think that's the difference.
Thank you
so much, Kathryn. I've got one more job for you tonight, Kathryn. Before I thank you, a number between 1 and 16, please.
14.
14? Okay. So just let me do my high-tech counting and I'll explain what's going on. And the winner of tonight's prize is Lee Gray, who is number 14 on my screen, maybe not on yours. That's the trick of the raffle where I get to be in charge. So congratulations, Lee. And if you could send me a postal address, then your prize will be on its way to you, as I understand, also in lockdown. So look, thank you very much, everybody. I'm mindful of the time. We've hit just 8:45. Kathryn, thank you for spending the time with us tonight. It was fascinating. It's a fabulous book. It's as your playwrights, critics would say, witty and poignant and important and lyrical and a jolly good read. So congratulations, Kathryn. And again, thank you on behalf of all our book clubbers, and thank you, everybody who's come today and spent the time with us.
Suzanne, can I just say one thing? I just realized that if I do have book plates, and if anyone did want a signed book plate for a copy of Fury, they could maybe let you know. Would that be all right? And then I could and just give an address, and I can arrange that to be sent.
Excellent, great. So I think that is, if anyone wants a book plate, just send me an email, and I might mention that can I mention that in the newsletter as well?
Yeah.
So basically just get in touch with me and we can talk about that in terms of bookshops as well. Lovely. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a good rest of your evening, and I look forward to seeing many of you next week. Bye.
Bye.